Welcome back, learners, with the course Rudimentary Principles and Practices of Managerial Economics, Module 2, Consumer Behavior 1, Lecture number 10, with the new topic Consumer Surplus. In the previous lecture, we have discussed in detail about Law of Equimarginal Utility. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss concepts and definitions of consumer surplus, assumptions of consumer surplus, tabular and graphical representation of consumer surplus, criticism and its importance. Consumer surplus. What do you mean by consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is also a buyer surplus, or you can say the benefit the consumer derived from using the commodity. Consumer surplus, in simple terms, we can say that the amount of money the consumer willing to pay for any goods and services and the price actually paid by, and the difference between the two is consumer surplus. So, it is the benefit that the consumer derived from using the product. Every rational consumer try to maximize its benefit. Every rational consumer. For example, suppose if you buy a ticket, air ticket, and you are thinking, and if you have to go to Delhi, and you are thinking the cost of that air ticket will cost you around 5,000 rupees. This 5,000 rupees is what you are thinking to pay, but when you actually purchase a ticket, you got that ticket with only 4,000 rupees. So, you intend to pay 5,000 and what you are actually paying, that is 4,000. So, the difference between the 5,000 and 4,000, that is your consumer surplus. So, consumer surplus is the difference between the marginal utility derived from the product and the total utility. So, consumer surplus, this concept was given by Dupuit in the year 1844. The concept of consumer surplus in the traditional approach was given by the Marshall, and he mentioned in his chapter called Consumer Rent that was famous in the pure theory of domestic value. Definition of consumer surplus: the excess of the price which a consumer would be willing to pay rather than go without a thing he actually does is the economic measure of this surplus satisfaction is termed as consumer surplus. So, we can say the utility derived from using the commodity and the price paid for that commodity. If your satisfaction is more than the price paid by the consumer, that extra is your benefit, that extra is the consumer surplus from that commodity. Consumer surplus can easily be calculated with the help of the formula, that is price consumer ready to pay minus price consumer actually pay. Second, you can say that the total utility minus total price of the commodity. Total price of the commodity means price into quantity. If you have to find it out the overall consumer surplus of the market, then the formula will be demand price minus actual price. So, in totality, we can say that consumer surplus it is the basic objective of every consumer to maximize its benefit. Assumption of consumer surplus. The very first assumption of this theory says that utility cannot be measured in terms of number, as it is based on cardinal approach. Cardinal approach itself says that it is measured in terms of number because it is a quantitative phenomena. Utility can be measured in terms of utils. That means the money spent by the consumer in purchasing the commodity. The second assumption of this law is no substitute for the commodity is available in the market. That means in market there is no close substitute available in the market. That means if the consumer can use only that product. The third assumption, income, fashion, interest, taste, preference of the consumer remains constant. Throughout the period of the consumption, the liking, disliking, preference, taste of the consumer need to be remains constant for performing this law. This law is based on law of diminishing marginal utility. Why? Because as you are going to consume more and more commodity, the utility derived from each successive unit goes on decreasing. So this law is based on the concept of diminishing marginal utility. Each commodity is independent and has no relationship with another commodity. This theory says that each commodity itself is unique and having no relation directly or indirectly with the other commodities available in the market. Because this law also assumes that there is no substitute available in the market. So when there is no substitute available, definitely the commodity will be an independent commodity. Marginal utility of money needs to be constant. This theory also assumes the value of the money remains constant because it is a cardinal approach. And cardinal approach assume this assumption of remaining the money to be constant. But in reality, money, the value of the money can never be constant. It can be increasing, it can be decreasing, sometime it can be constant, but it can never be constant throughout the period of consumption. That was the assumption of consumer surplus. So basically, the consumer surplus, this theory will applicable when all this assumption will be satisfied, and the basic objective of this consumer surplus is to increase the benefit of the consumer, what the consumer is thinking to pay and what he actually pay for the product. For example, suppose you want to purchase any commodity and you think that this commodity will cost you around 5 to 8,000 rupees, maybe 8,000 rupees. And when you actually visited the store and you asked for the price, and the price of that product is only 5,000 rupees. So you are getting a benefit of 3,000 rupees. This 3,000 is nothing but the consumer surplus. In consumer surplus, we are saying everything in terms of money because this is based on the approach of Cardinal. And Cardinal says in terms of money. Next, tabular and graphical representation of consumer surplus. Take an imaginary example to explain this concept. Suppose you have a very intense want to have a cake. You really want to have a cake, and you know when the intensity of any want is very high, higher is the intensity, higher is the utility, and higher the price you are ready to pay for it. So here a consumer really want to consume the cake because he is having the high demand for the cake. And the price of that cake is 200 rupees. So what will be the consumer surplus in this case? If the consumer get a cake with that 200 rupees, then there will be no consumer surplus. If the consumer will get a cake less than that, then there will be a consumer surplus. So there is a table. That table consists of 4 columns. The first column is the quantity. That means consumption of the cake. The second is the marginal utility. Marginal utility means additional utility while consuming one more unit of commodity. Third column is market price. Market price means the price of the product in the market. And the fourth column is consumer surplus. So, as per this example, you can see the consumer is increasing the consumption of the cake one by one. When the consumer consumes first unit of the cake, he is ready to pay for that cake was 1000. 1000 was the cost of the cake. So, that is what he is ready to pay. But actually the price of the cake is 200. So, what he is willing and what he actually pay, the difference is consumer surplus. So, here 1000 minus 200 is giving him the consumer surplus of 800 rupees in terms of rupees. So, on second unit he is ready to pay 800, but what he actually paying is 200. Again he is getting the surplus of 600 rupees. Consumer surplus in terms of 600. In the third cake, he is ready to pay 600, then he is ready to pay 500, then he is ready to pay 400, then he is ready to pay 200. So, what can you see? You can see as he is increasing the consumption of the commodity, the marginal utility is getting reduced, or you can say he is less willing to pay. Why he is less willing to pay? Because his want is getting satisfied. And that is why for less utility, he is paying less money. And for high utility, he is ready to pay high price. That is why as he is consuming, the marginal utility is reducing from 1000 to 800, 800 to 600, 500, 400 and 200. But throughout the period, the price which he paid for the product was 200 only. At what level the consumer should stop consuming any further commodity? A consumer should stop consuming any further commodity the point where the willingness which he is ready to pay becomes equal to the price of that product. When he is consuming this 6 unit of commodity, he is ready to pay only 200 because now the intensity of the want is completely vanished and the price of the product is also 200. The 200 minus 200 gives you 0. That means at this point, consumer is not getting any surplus. So this is the alarm position that now the consumer should stop consuming any commodity, because if he is going to consume any further commodity, then the consumer surplus will be converted into consumer deficit. He will be in loss. So this is the equilibrium for the consumer, where the consumer is getting the maximum position, maximum satisfaction, or you can say it is a position of no change. Above this point, the consumer is in consumer surplus. Below this point, the consumer will be in consumer disbenefit or consumer deficit. So the overall, the consumer surplus is, he has spent 3,500 rupees. You can say he has spent 3,500 rupees which he was willing to pay, or the marginal utility which he has derived from using the commodity. And what he actually paid, that was total 1,200. So the overall satisfaction the consumer derived from consuming the entire product was 2,300 in terms of money, because this approach is based on cardinal approach, so you cannot rank. You can only express in terms of money. I have spent this much of money and I get a satisfaction of this much. So 2,300 is the consumer surplus for the consumer. Graph. What is consumer surplus as per the graphical representation? You can see y-axis 0 and x-axis. On x-axis, unit of cake is there. On y-axis, marginal utility, or you can say the price you are ready to pay. And the consumer surplus you can say the demand curve is sloping downward from left to right. From left to right, because you are consuming and more commodity, definitely your utility is going to be reduced. So your demand curve is going to move from left towards the right. For example, you can see a point. OP is the point. OP is the point, you can say OP is the price, and OM is the commodity. So consumer is ready to pay. Consumer is ready to pay OQ level of price for OM level of quantity. But when he actually visited the market, he is paying only OP price for the OM level of quantity. So what he is actually paying, this is this much, OP and OM, and the consumer surplus is this area, because you are going to subtract. He was ready to pay this entire area, but he is paying only this area. So he is paying only this area. He is getting, this is the consumer surplus for him. You can see a graph is already there. Utility is shown on y-axis, unit of cake is shown on the x-axis. This blue line is representing the overall the consumer is ready to pay. And this orange line represents the price of the product which he actually paying. So this area, this entire area is the consumer surplus. This entire area is the consumer surplus, because 200 was the price. If consumer continues to consume any commodity, you can extend this graph like this. Okay? So your marginal utility, as I already told you people, marginal utility is of three types: the positive, zero and negative. So from this area, from this point to this point, your marginal utility was positive. At sixth level of unit where consumer surplus is 0, that means your marginal utility is 0. So at sixth, the marginal utility is 0. And if you are going to consume further any unit, your marginal utility will turns into negative, and negative means your consumer surplus will be converted into the consumer deficit. So this area, this shaded area is the consumer surplus, and if you continue below, then this area will be the consumer deficit. Importance of consumer surplus. This law is very useful and it has very importance as well. The very first importance is it helps in comparison of economic status. With the help of the consumer surplus concept, you can actually check the status of the economy. That means you can compare the economic status of one country with the other country. For example, if country A is having a consumer surplus in comparison to the country B, that means the consumer of the country A is benefiting. They are getting the maximum satisfaction. They are using their money rationally. So definitely the economy will be in progressive in nature. In comparison to the country where is the consumer deficit, so consumers are not using the money rationally, they are not thinking twisely, so they are not making optimum utilization of the scarce resources. So with the help of consumer surplus, you can actually check the economic condition of the country, because the economic condition of the country is decided by the people of the country. It is the people who actually work hard and make the country better. Second, tax consideration as per consumer surplus. Consumer surplus concept is also very helpful in terms of taxation. Government plans how much tax need to be imposed. A progressive taxation is generally imposed. Progressive means the tax depends upon the income of the consumer. Higher is the income, higher the tax you need to pay. Lower is the income, lower the tax you need to be pay. Because this concept is based on cardinal approach. Cardinal approach says the marginal utility remains constant, but marginal utility for richer people is less and marginal utility for poor people is more. That is why the government charge higher taxes for higher salary group, higher income group and less from the lesser income group. Next, difference between price of the product and the utility attained. Consumer surplus is also very useful. What should be the price and what is the utility derived from the product? Simply, sometimes there are few commodities which you get at a very less cost. For example, newspaper, the price of newspaper is quite low, but the utility of the newspaper is very high. You get a lot of information by reading the newspaper. So the difference between the price of the product and the utility attained. Sometimes there are various products whose price is very cheaper, but the benefit from that product is very high. And what consumer surplus means the utility from the product should be more than the money spent on the product. Next, importance in exchange process. The concept of consumer surplus is also benefit for buyer and seller in the market. For example, you are exchanging the goods, and when you are exchanging the goods, everybody wants a benefit, whether it is a seller, whether it is a buyer, whether it is a consumer, whether it is a producer, everybody wants a surplus. So what you are thinking and what you are getting, you will exchange till the point it becomes equal to each other. The moment it will become to each other, you are going to stop purchasing any further commodity. Price determined by the monopoly. In monopoly market, only a seller is going to decide the price. The seller cannot charge a very high price for the product, because if it is going to charge the high price, what the consumer thinking, then consumer will not be in consumer surplus. Maybe the one day you can charge a high price, maybe 2 days you can charge a high price. For a shorter run, it is very benefit. But for a longer period of the time, the consumer satisfaction and consumer happiness is very important for the progress of any company, for the progress of any organization, because consumer are the king of the market. So you have to make them satisfied first, then with their satisfaction you can increase your profit in the long run. So it is very useful for the monopoly market to decide the price so as to maintain the consumer surplus of the consumer. International trade. Consumer surplus is very useful in terms of international trade, because nowadays every economy is an open economy. Every economy, every country is buying and selling, importing and exporting with each other. Generally, a company what do? Generally, what a country do? Country import a cheaper item and country try to export the item which they can produce at a large level. So you want to purchase those commodity into your country and get a consumer surplus. For example, country A want to produce any commodity, maybe rice, and the cost of the rice is very high. If the cost of the rice is very high, then you cannot maintain the consumer surplus. So it's better to import the rice, provide the good at a cheaper cost and provide the consumer surplus to your consumer. So consumer surplus concept is also very helpful in the international trade, and with this there is a international trade between the countries. They continuously buy, they continuously import and export the commodity. Criticism. Criticism of consumer surplus. Every law has its assumption. As I already told, that assumption is not a realistic assumption. So the assumption itself is the criticism of the law. The very first criticism of this law is in case of compulsory commodities. Compulsory items. You are ready to buy the necessary items at any cost. You're not going to think for the consumer surplus. Suppose if a person is poor and if he or she is ill, definitely whatever is the cost of medicine, the consumer is going to purchase. So here the consumer surplus is not fruitful. So in case of compulsory items, in case of necessary items, the willingness of the consumer and actually the consumer is paying for the product get lost. Whatever is the price of the necessary, you are ready to pay for it. Second, in case of prestigious commodities. Prestigious commodities are the commodities which gives you a sense of satisfaction, or you can say a sense of status symbol. Because richer people try to prefer an expensive item. They will purchase when the price of the product is high, because that is the symbol of status that differentiate them with one people with the other people. So consumer surplus does not applicable in case of prestigious commodity, because generally people think what? They are paying less, and that is why there is a consumer surplus. But in that case they are paying more, and paying more because they want to distinct themselves with the others. So in case of the prestigious commodity, it is not applicable. Problems in measurement of utility. Again, you cannot measure utility in terms of number, because there is no authentic measurement like height, weight, temperature. There is no standard unit of measuring the money. So if there is no standard unit of measuring the money, how can you measure the utility derived from the product in terms of money? Next, issues with changes in income and interest of the consumer. This law assumes income, fashion, price, interest, taste, likes, everything need to be constant. But nowadays in real world, can anyone say that my income will remain this, or my preference only be this? No. With the passage of the time, with the development of the economy, with the changes in the everything in this world, nothing is static. Everything do get changed. So the liking, disliking, preference, income, everything of the consumer do get changed with the passage of the time. Relation of one commodity with the other commodity. This law assumes that a commodity is an independent and having no relationship with the other commodity, because there is no substitute available for it. But in reality, there are only two things. Either there will be a substitute good, or either there will be a complementary goods. So every commodity has some or the other substitute. Maybe tea and coffee, this is the substitute goods. So if the price of the tea is going to be increased, you are going to substitute it to the coffee. If the price of the coffee is going to be increased, you are going to substitute it with the tea. So if the substitute goods are available, how can you maintain this consumer surplus? If the price is high, you are going to easily shift here and you are going to purchase something else. So this is all about for today's session, in which we have discussed consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is basically the benefit which each and every individual consumer wants. Why? because the income of the consumer is limited and they have an unlimited want. To satisfy, to maximize their benefit, their utility, they need to be very rational. They try to maximize this benefit. In entire module 2, we have discussed about the behavior of the consumer, the pattern of the consumer, how they are purchasing, what they are doing, because entire module 2 was based on cardinal approach of utility that consists of the chapters like law of diminishing marginal utility, law of equimarginal utility and consumer surplus. All these 3 law is based on the assumption that marginal utility do get fall with each and every successive unit, because this is based on the cardinal approach, and cardinal approach says that you can measure the utility in terms of number. But that was the biggest drawbacks. Modern economists said that you cannot measure utility in terms of number, rather you can preference. So in the coming module, that is 3, we are going to study the behavior of the consumer on the pattern of indifference curve analysis and reveal preference theory based on ordinal approach that gives the preference, how the consumer is going to make the choice. So thank you for today's session.